All right, so today's presentation is going to be on physical protection. Shorter, easier one, so that'll be good for today. Not too many curveballs here, so pretty straightforward. It's kind of the way we like them. One thing on the nomenclatures, on the important updates, there hasn't been anything new to post here. However, I did want to throw out, we partner at Ntiva with a company called Prevail, spelled Preveil, and they have a cloud-based SaaS offering for storing CUI. And one of the things that they do, if you're interested, is you can go out to their website and they have webinars set up for the Deputy DoD CIO, David McCown, as well as the Cyber AB. I can't remember Stacy's last name, but they do quite a few of these. I believe today there's one going as well this afternoon for an hour, and it's going to be like lessons learned from the first CMMC assessments. They've been ramping up kind of the frequency of them. So over the last couple months, they're starting to have them every few weeks. If you're interested, though, those would be good ones to sign up for. Once you sign up for the first one, then they'll notify you via email of all the upcoming ones so that you can register. But you'll get some good information on the process, the things that they're asking the DoD to do, different documentation efforts that they go through, potential rule changes. They have Q&A where most of the questions that they answer thus far have been ones that people had already submitted prior to the call, although they will attempt, if they have time, to answer ones on the call. But a lot of good information there that I think is worth listening to if your organization is getting closer to wanting to actually get a certification. If you want to be in the voluntary group or you expect to be in kind of a mandatory group, you can get the latest and greatest news in those. And then I believe they also will record them and send you a link afterwards where if you want to view it, it's almost like you just go out and re-register, but when you register the second time, it knows that it's already passed and will allow you to just watch it and potentially download it. But again, a lot of good information there. I would definitely say take a look, and that's Prevail, Preveil. Today, we have the same two family-specific resources as we had last time, 846 and 800-114, so nothing changed there. And only 6 controls to go through. Again, all pretty straightforward. I'm going to try to point out some things that maybe are overlooked and not thought about as frequently, and then a little bit diving into the CUI thing at the end, but pretty straightforward. So limiting access to the system's equipment and respective operating environments for authorized individuals, pretty straightforward. Most folks don't have any problems with that concept. However, it does become a little bit more difficult, I guess, or complex, depending on the type of office setup you have, the number of vendors you deal with, whether it's a co-located space shared with other people, whether you have like a government site and a contractor site. So just depending on your organization, it could be more or less complex. But while the actual control is primarily intended to cover employees and visitors, I wanted to point out some things through these slides that you shouldn't overlook. Vendors that come on site, maintenance staff where applicable, again, depends on your location, building owners, etc. So you might have somebody, for example, who comes through and checks the fire sprinklers. They check the power, they check the HVAC. They may have access to the space because the building owner has provided that, and you leasing the space, they have to go through your doors and your locks and your systems, but nonetheless they can get in. So when you're thinking about employees and visitors, don't overlook them as potentially a visitor, and the fact that they might be doing things in off hours because it's less disruptive to your business. So you may not be there, they come in, did you even know? Did they have to swipe in? How is your building or facility logically and physically separated? Can they get to the mechanical components without getting to places where you might have CUI, and your workstations, etc. So really case specific per organization, but it's things you shouldn't overlook. Then some common measures that are included here: smart cards, CAT cards if you have DoD, badges, ID, and don't overlook the fact that you can get a company badge, but then you may also get a building badge or a suite badge. Sometimes they're the same thing, sometimes they're different, but how are you managing that? Does everyone have it? Does it have a photo ID on it or a picture to represent who the person is? So as they walk around, you know they should have it, versus they just grabbed any blank white card, put it on a lanyard and you think that they work there. Also, this is a requirement that applies to areas that are not publicly accessible. If it's a public space, it's going to be completely different. I think that kind of goes without saying, but just understand what you would call publicly accessible and what you wouldn't. And again, a lot of this comes down to where your facilities are located in the setup of that type of building. And then make sure you're compliant with local, state, federal laws, any policies, regulations, standards, procedures, guidelines. It's great that you can look at something and say, well, I'm good from my contract perspective, or I'm good from what this entity expects of me, but are you overlooking other entities, especially if you're talking about federal government and DoD? Make sure that you're not only meeting the policies and regulations, but that they don't differ. Taking as an example, state and federal. If you were talking about incident response, you might have a reporting structure and a timeline that's different for the state than you do federal government. So when it comes to physical protection, same thing. Do they have different laws, or are they the same? So as long as you're following one, by default, you're following all of them. Don't overlook things like locked rooms, cabinets, and safes. They're a great place for putting smaller devices. So if you've got hard drives, small computing devices, phones, very similar to like, DoD might do, where if you're going to enter a SCIF, you're not allowed to bring a cell phone. So they may have a box to put them in next to the door. They may have an armed guard where you have to sign it in and out and it goes into a basket. But if possible, if the building will allow it, why even go to that point? Why not put it into like a locked cabinet or a locked room, so that you don't rely on someone else to protect your asset? So just things to think about. Most of them are pretty common sense. But again, don't assume that because you hear something or see something that it's automatically going to be applicable to the way you're set up. Protect and monitor the physical facility and support infrastructure, kind of just building off of what's already there, but now let's look really at the building in more depth. You need to provide protection and monitoring. Obviously, multiple layers of defense or defense in depth approach is the preferred for better security. And this can come about whether or not you're using armed guards, camera systems, sensor devices, barricades. So if you've got a gate, or you've got I forget what they call them, but the poles that come up out of the ground near the building, or the blockade that comes up next to a gate, so that if you tried to crash through the gate, it will stop the vehicle. All those types of things are going to be dependent upon where you are, the type of data you have, et cetera, but they're things you have to take into consideration. Then make sure that what you're doing is appropriate for the level of security you need. This seems like common sense, so I don't want to harp on it, but it has implications primarily from a cost perspective. If you only need a camera system and some door locks, can you pay for armed guards? Sure. Does it provide any additional value for whatever you're protecting? Maybe, maybe not. That's a business decision, but don't assume that you have to go all the way. Use a good, better, best model. Make sure you're at least meeting the minimum requirements of the contractor or CMMC guidelines, but then determine how appropriate it is to spend extra. The reason I say this is not to downplay security in any way, but there's a lot of areas that you can spend your money from a security perspective. If you spend too much in one area, you may not leave enough money left over to hit the minimums everywhere else. If it were me, I would hit the minimums everywhere, see how much is left, and then beef up those areas that are most important or most critical. Again, don't overlook the less obvious areas that need security. This could be transmission or communication lines, power lines, battery backups, HVAC, cooling systems. Again, very dependent upon your building. Power lines may be run underground, so you don't have to worry about a pole being hit, but someone could be cutting outside doing landscaping and cut your power. Same with your internet connection. HVAC and cooling systems, if they were to go down, is it a security problem necessarily? Well, not necessarily from a building, like someone's going to be hacked, trying to climb in through an HVAC system, but it then could take down other systems because they have to be cooled to be able to operate. So what if your actual security system is dependent upon being in a cooled environment and that goes down? So look at those kind of like chains that and the effects that they cause. Don't overlook unintentional damage or disruption. A lot of times we focus on malicious. What would an attacker do? But what about the flooding of basements and high-rise buildings? I brought up the Hurricane Sandy in New York incident because this one made a lot of news after the fact, where in large cities where space is at a premium, the costs go up the higher you go up in the floors. So if I have a 100-story high-rise, I'm not going to put my HVAC systems on the 100th floor because it's far more expensive. It's where the penthouse would be. So they were putting them in the basements and then not realizing that when a large storm comes through, the water floods the basements, the parking lots, those kinds of things. So all of their equipment went down. You might lose elevators, you lose HVAC, you lose battery, you lose power. These are things that I don't think people were looking at because a hurricane hitting New York was not a commonality, yet it proved that if you don't plan for these things in advance, you could be out of luck. So the same type of thing should be done wherever you're at. And then make sure you're compliant with requirements for your contract, your industry. For example, with DoD, on base, you can have classified and unclassified cabling running throughout the building, and it can be in the same building. It can be in similar crawl spaces and overhead, but they have specific rules about how close wires can be, how you can cross, if you can cross, and does it need to be perpendicular? All these little nuances, it's not as simple as just slapping a wire across the building and giving yourself connectivity. So look at all of these things and make sure you're following the guidelines, again, not only from a CMMC perspective, but potentially from a contract or any of the clauses that they have in the contract. Escorting visitors and monitoring visitor access. This one's very common, not much to talk about here, but one of the points to touch on is whether or not visitors are truly visitors. At what point do they become what we would almost call like permanent personnel, where they would get physical access through authorized credentials? So this one might really have to do more so with how often they're going to be there and what's your comfort level. If they only come into your building once a year, then obviously a visitor badge is more than acceptable. If it's once a month, is it worth it, or should they have a real badge? And make sure that all those activities and access logs are available to you. They're reviewed on a recurring schedule, that everything's dumping into a log system. It's great if you have a camera system, but if you're not able to access those logs, retain those logs, query them and tie them to other logging systems, then you're probably not getting the most benefit out of it that you could or should. And probably most important, and this is really from a certification perspective, not a security perspective, is that your reviews match what you've indicated in your policies and procedures. I have not obviously gone through a CMMC audit yet, but like any other audit, the last thing you would want to do is tell an auditor, I review these logs monthly as it's written in your policy, but then your evidence shows that you review them quarterly or as needed. Whatever you're saying you're doing, you need to be, actually be doing. So if you're not, change your policies to update it. It's probably better to risk that you're not doing something frequently enough, but that it matches versus saying you do it at an acceptable frequency, but then you're not actually doing it and you can't provide the evidence. Maintain audit logs of physical access. So while manual or automated logging is obviously acceptable, look at all of the costs for both. An automated system may cost more out of the gate because you're paying for the software itself, but if it's manual, how fast can you do something manually versus automated? What's the cost of each of these? What's the cost of your time? What efficiencies are gained by automating? It may be more costly and more time consuming to do something manually than it was in an automated fashion. It may be less money out of pocket up front for the manual, but are you looking at it for what does it cost me day one, or is it what is it costing me each year? Whenever possible, try to capture the electronic logs for any device or system that will allow it, and for ones that won't, document those and try to create manual processes. Depending on legacy systems, how outdated things are, whether they tie into other systems, manual might be the only way to go, but it's probably a good idea to do an inventory and figure out which ones can be automated. Review not only the logs themselves for activity, but the effectiveness of the systems. How many times has a building changed, a layout changed, ingress, egress has changed, but no one goes back and checks if the camera placement is correct. If you have the right number of cameras, are they looking at the right spot? How easy is it to access the logs? How easy is it to get the data in the event of an outage? So if you're storing the logs on site in a server rack and the building loses power for whatever reason, are you able to retrieve the logs? If not, it might not be an effective system. And test that all the systems are performing as designed and are intended. The last thing you want to do is be going through some form of disaster or security incident, then find out that your systems don't work as intended. A great example of this is backup and restorations. People do backups of servers all the time, and then they find when they do the restoration, it doesn't work. That would be great to know in advance. Control and manage physical access devices. A lot of different ways to do this. I gave a few here: keys, locks, combinations, card readers. Probably the more important thing here is not what you choose, but that you have an accurate inventory of the devices at all times. Who have you assigned them to? Who are they registered to? Do you get them back when someone changes roles and no longer needs them, when someone's terminated for whatever reason? Can you pinpoint all of the devices that you've handed out and who has them, to include people like vendors, maintenance personnel? How do you ensure you're getting them back when those third parties change personnel? And then you're probably always, as just good practice, going to have extras or spares on site that, you know, you'll have them when you need them, but where are they stored? Where are they inventoried? Who has access to them? You know, what stops someone from just grabbing one of your spares, creating access to it, and then throwing it back in a drawer, and you truly have no idea who used it. And then finally, this one is a little bit harder because even 800-171 refers you to the two documents that I told you about on one of our first slides to get guidance on enterprise and user security when teleworking. Teleworking, you know, because of COVID, has become much more of a reality. So I would say dive deeper into those two and see if you're kind of doing what they intend. But the main gist of this is to review and know the security requirements and capabilities at alternate sites. You'll have to define, just like at the beginning of this presentation, what you're considering an alternate site. Is that a government site when you're down? Is that a corporate office when you can't go to government offices because they're closed? Do you have vendor spaces? Are you calling private residents? That's very important to define and document, and then figure out, will CUI be allowed in any of those locations? How will it be transported? How will it be stored? How can you validate that the security requirements that you've put in place from a policy perspective are actually being met? It's easy to say I have a policy that says you must lock something, but how do you know that any of your employees lock it up once they leave the office? So this one is probably the most difficult, just because of how much time and effort you have to put into both creating your business processes and policies, but then validating that they work. A lot of the other ones are very simple. They might be on site in an office. All you have to do is go into the office and check. And it's one central system, so it's a lot easier to grab logs, say, from a camera than it is to ask 50, validate 50 employees who have CUI at home are storing it properly. And from a business perspective, maybe you don't want to offer that as an option, so you have to go an alternative route. All right, like I said, that one was a shorter, quicker one, thankfully. Give everybody a couple minutes of their day back, but I'll hang out here for a second in case there are any questions. Okay, if not, appreciate you guys attending today and have a great afternoon.